Let's start by building this small piece of UI from the Discord app right here, this message component. And I'm going to start off in this blank app. This happens to be a React app, but don't worry if you've never used React before. The lessons we're covering apply to any tool or framework. The biggest difference is that we use class name instead of class in React. Okay, so to start, we can see that Discord has this kind of darker theme to it. So let's just start by making the background of our app black. Now we can do this using the BG Black utility class from Tailwind. And just like that, we can see our paragraph text is black. Now we can't read our text anymore, so let's go ahead and make our text white. And right away, we see the styles change. So this is really the heart of Tailwind. It's these little utility classes that we apply directly to our markup to style our app without having to write any of our own custom CSS. Let's keep going, and we'll make this a min height of the full screen, so it takes up all this space. Let's update this tag to be a div, and let's give it a display of flex with items center and justify center. So Tailwind utilities are composable, which just means that each one of these classes does just one thing. And if we pop open our dev tools, we can actually see that right here. We see that the flex class applies the display flex CSS rule, item center applies align item center, and so on. And this is a really handy way just to see what each one of these classes is actually doing as you learn Tailwind. Okay, the background over in Discord is not pure black, so we can come back and change this to a gray. Now, Tailwind actually comes with lots of colors out of the box. There's grays, blues, greens, and reds, and for each color, there are actually many shades. So for grays, we have gray 900 as the darkest gray, and then we go all the way down to gray 100 as the lightest gray, with even a 50 for just a touch lighter. And in our case, let's go with 700 for our background. Now you can see this gray doesn't match Discord's exactly. Later in the series, we'll talk about customizing these colors so we can get a perfect fit, but for now, we'll stick with the defaults. Okay, let's take another look at this message component. We see it has an image, a name and a date, and then the actual message. So let's start with the image. I'll come over here and let's drop in an image tag of Adam. So we can see the image tag being rendered, but it's a little bit big. And we can use some Tailwind utilities to control the sizing. If we set the width to 4 and the height to 4, we'll see this makes the image pretty tiny. And if we inspect this, we can see that this ends up being a 16 by 16 image. This 4 comes from Tailwind's default spacing scale, which is in rems. And rems are a best practice to use as a unit in CSS, but we can see that there's a 1:4 ratio between the Tailwind spacing scale and the 16 pixels that our image ends up being right here. So if we want to know the final pixel value of any of these sizes, we just multiply by 4. If we pop over to Discord and inspect this image, we can see that it is 40 by 40 right here. So 40 divided by 4 is 10, which means we should just be able to set this to width and height of 10, come back to our app, and now we'll have a 40 by 40 image. The next thing about this avatar is that it's rounded, and we can achieve that in our app using the rounded class. Now you'll see by default, rounded just adds a little bit of border radius to the image, but there is a rounded full class that will make it a complete circle. And now our image is looking pretty good. Now let's add a new paragraph tag, and we'll add Adam Wathan as the name and 01/15/2021 as the date. And let's style these. First, we can give the name here a color of text green, let's say 500. We also want to add just a little bit of space here to the right of the image. So we can come to our image and add margin right of 4 on the spacing scale. And we'll also add a little bit of margin to the right of the name. Now let's also make the name a little bit smaller, and we'll make the date extra small. And if we look at Discord, we can see the date is a little bit lighter. So let's just soften this text a little bit. We'll make this text gray 500. Okay, and let's wrap the image and the text in a new div. And we'll make this a flex container as well. And the paragraph will be flex items baseline so that everything's nice and tidy up at the top. One thing you'll notice when working with Tailwind is that it doesn't really abstract away CSS at all. So if you want to lay out your UI elements using flexbox, you have to know how flexbox works in order to use it with Tailwind. And this is a good thing because the more you use Tailwind, the better at CSS you'll actually become. Okay, so one last thing on our heading here. Let's make the name a little bit thicker by changing the font weight using font medium. And I think that looks pretty good. So now we can grab the text of this first message, come back to our app, and let's drop it right below this heading here. Okay, we want these to be on top of each other, so let's wrap this in a div. And let's also wrap all of our content in a new div with a class name of max width large. Now again, if we flip over to Discord, we can see that the text is not pure white, it's a little bit softer than that. So we can come down to our paragraph and make it text gray 300. All right, let's grab the next message. Now in Discord, conceptually, you can see as we hover this, we highlight the full width here for each message. So conceptually, these are different things. So we're going to copy this and we're going to put it in an entirely new container that is a sibling to this first image and paragraph wrapper. So back in our code, that would be this div right here. We'll drop a new div with a paragraph and our second message. Let's also make this one text gray 300. And you can see it's not aligned. Now, one nice thing about the fact that Tailwind uses the spacing scale for things like width and margins is that we can just add these up. So we know this image is width 10 and it has a margin right of 4 on it. So this total space right here is 14. So we should be able to come down to our new paragraph and add padding left of 14 and get it to perfectly line up. Now we can also come to this wrapper div right here and go ahead and add a margin top of 1 just to give it a little bit of space, because we can see in Discord there's just a little bit of space in between messages. Now let's go ahead and grab this last message, come back, and we'll just duplicate this and put in our last message. Now I'll zoom out just a little bit here, and let's go ahead and apply this hover treatment. So when we hover a message, we get a slightly darker background, and in Tailwind, we can do that pretty simply using the hover prefix. So remember, our app is currently a background of gray 700. Let's make it a background of gray 800 when we hover a message. And now we can see that new background is working. It's a little dark though, and Discord actually uses a background opacity to lighten it up. So we can actually do the same thing with Tailwind using background opacity, and let's say 30%. And that looks pretty good. Now, if we pop over to Discord, we can see there's a little space on the side and above each message for the background. So let's come back over to our container, add some padding in the X direction of space 4, and just a little bit in the Y direction of space 1. And let's grab these classes and apply exactly the same treatment to our other message containers. And now we can see all of our messages have the hover treatment, and this is looking really good. So we ended up with a really nice reproduction of some custom UI here, and we didn't write a single line of CSS. No new files to maintain, no custom naming pattern that we had to come up with or explain to our coworkers, and this is one of the biggest value propositions of Tailwind. We just get to use all these shared utilities directly in our markup. This is absolutely one of my favorite things about this library because how you break up your HTML and your templates depends so much on your team and what technology you're using. And with Tailwind, all your styling code lives right here in the markup and just comes along for the ride. So that's it for this quick intro, and I'll see you in the next video. When scaffolding an app layout, I like to start from the outside in. So taking a look at Discord, I kind of see three main pieces here. We have the server selector, the channel selector, and then this main message area. So let's come over to our app and just start with 3 new divs. We'll have servers, channels, and our main area. Now by default, these divs lie on top of each other, but we can use the flex utility class, which will give our app a flex layout with the default flex direction of row. Now over in Discord, we can see the server selector is kind of the darkest gray, and then the channel selector is a little bit lighter, and the main is the lightest. So let's give our server selector a background of gray 800. Channels will be background gray of 700. And the main area will be background gray 600. And we'll make the text white so we can read it. Now let's make our parent container here a height of the full screen so that all of these divs fill up the available space. Now, if we hop back over to Discord, we'll see that the server selector and the channel selector kind of have this fixed width, but as the user resizes the app, it's really this main area that takes up the available space. And flexbox is perfect for this. We can tell our layout to have the main panel here take up all the available space using the flex1 utility class. And now, if we pop open the inspector, we can see it does just that. So this is why I like Flexbox for application layouts. It's really easy to pick which panel should grow and shrink and which ones should be fixed. Now let's add just a little bit of padding to each one of these panels using the padding utilities. These utilities use Tailwind's default spacing scale, which starts with 0 for no padding, then goes to 1, which is just 4 pixels of padding. So you can see here, it adds just a little bit of padding around servers. And then we can go to 2 for 8 pixels, 3 for 12, and so on. So we'll go with P4 on all 3 of these panels. And now we're seeing our layout kind of start to come together. Next, let's just make a white div for a dummy server selector here, just so we can visualize this a little bit better. And the way we can make a white circle is just by using a new div here, and we'll drop TW in just so we have some content. We'll go ahead and make the background white, and we'll make the text gray 800. And we want to give this white box a certain size. So over here, we can inspect one of these and see that these are 48 by 48 pixels. So we can explicitly set the width and height of our box to 48 pixels using the width and height utilities. Now width uses the same spacing scale the padding does. So it starts off as 0, 1 is 4 pixels, which is really small, 2 is 8 pixels, and so on. In our case, we want 12 for 48 pixels, and we'll also set the height to 12 as well. And that will give us our 48 pixel box. Now we can use rounded to make this a rounded rectangle, and there's a rounded full class, which will make it a complete circle. And then to center the title, we can go ahead and use flex, item center, justify center, because that's just the easiest way to center this text. So our server panel is looking pretty good. Let's come back to Discord and look at the channel selector. Now, because these channels are all different lengths, we can just go ahead and use a fixed width on this panel right here, regardless of the content. And if we inspect this, we can see that this is 240 pixels. So back in our clone, let's come to our channels panel, and we'll use W-60 to get this to be 240 pixels. Now, if we come back and make this a little bit smaller here with the inspector, we can see that we still have the behavior where our main panel is flexing to take up the additional space, but our server and channel selectors remain fixed. So you can see that Tailwind's default spacing scale is really nice to work with. Every unit on the scale is 4 pixels and is used across a lot of the common utilities like padding, margin, width, and height. Now, looking back at the channel selector, we see that there's actually this fixed header here. And as we scroll the channels, this part takes up the rest of the space. So again, we have a good situation for Flexbox here. We want this entire panel to be a new flex parent, this to be a fixed height, and this part to flex to the available space. So let's take a look and see how tall this is. It's 48 pixels. So we'll come back to our channels here and drop in 2 new divs, one for the header and one for the channels. Now again, we want to make the parent a new flex parent, and we'll see that by default, the direction is rows, so these are laid out next to each other, but we actually want these to be on top of each other, so we'll use flex call to change the direction to column. And now let's just give our channels a background of black so we can kind of see this layout as we build it. Okay, first let's move the padding off of the parent. we'll drop it right here, and we'll also drop it on this panel. And now we can see we kind of have our two panels right here, but really it would be nice if conceptually this channels part stretched to fill the remaining space, even though we don't have a lot of content in there right now, again, just because that is kind of what's going on in Discord. So we can do that just like before using the flex1 utility. And there it stretches out. So let's remove background black. And we can add a bit of shadow here to the header using the shadow MD utility. And now we have a nice little header treatment here with a channels panel that's ready for the rest of our content. If we look at the main panel, we'll see it's a similar treatment with this header, a little shadow, and then a scrollable main area. So let's just copy this treatment, come here, remove the padding. We'll put general here and messages. And again, we can drop a background black on our messages just to see that right now it's not filling up this whole space. But if we make this a flex parent and flex call, it should do the trick. So now if we resize this, we'll see that everything is flexing in the right direction. The things we want fixed, like the header and the width of these two panels over here, are staying the same. And Flexbox is doing a good job of laying out the rest of these things for us. So that's kind of how I think about using Flexbox for app layouts. The Tailwind utilities make it really easy to tinker around because these little utilities are just doing one thing. It's easy to pull them on and off different panels. And it's also just a great way to practice and improve your skills with Flexbox. Let's make all these panels scrollable, and we'll start with the server selector right here. Back in our app, we can see right now our padding is a little bit bigger. So first, let's just tweak these padding values, and we'll go ahead and bring them all down to padding 3. And now our servers panel here lines up exactly with Discord. So we want to add a few more dummy servers here, and we can use a little trick to do this. We'll just create a new array of length 40. And if we spread that into an empty array, we can actually map over this, just like this. So that's an easy way to generate some dummy data. And we can use the space y2 utility here to add some space in between each one of these servers. Okay, and let's grab the index from this map function right here, and we'll just drop that just like this, so we can have some different data to work with. Now we see that our servers here are overflowing our application. And by default, that's exactly what Flex is going to do. But we can come to our parent here and just add an overflow y scroll to make it so that anything that goes beyond the constraints are actually just going to scroll. And so now we can see that right here, the application is still constrained to the window, but our server list scrolls just like it does in Discord. So that's pretty simple, and that is the basic idea behind making these Flexbox panels scrollable. So let's move on to our channel list here. Now over in Discord, the fixed header right here is 48 pixels tall, and then the rest of this channels list is what actually scrolls. So back in our app, we can see that the header is also 48 pixels, but it just kind of happens to be because of how we're using this padding. So instead, let's remove the vertical padding, and we'll give it a fixed height using H12, which is going to give us that 48 pixel height. And now we want to center the text, so we'll use flex item center. And now our heading is locked in place at 48 pixels, no matter what the contents are here. Okay, and let's grab this 40 element treatment here and come in our channels panel and basically do the same thing. And here we'll go ahead and put in our channel. And we'll drop the index here just so we can see what's going on. Now you'll see that our Flexbox layout has actually shrunk our header to make room for all these channels here now that they're taking up all this space. Well, in Flexbox, we can tell it not to shrink the header using the flex shrink 0 utility class. And that will always reserve these 48 pixels for our header. Okay, so that's looking a little bit better, but our channels are still overflowing our layout here. So let's do the same thing we did to our servers, come to the parent and add overflow Y scroll. And now our channels should be scrollable just like our servers are over here. And we can do the same thing and add a little bit of space so that this matches Discord a little bit better. Now, once we tell our layout that this div should be scrollable, we can actually remove this flex shrink 0 right here because it's smart enough to know, hey, we're already scrolling, so we don't need to take up any more space from this header. But I wanted to show you that in case you have static panels that aren't scrollable. Again, it's good to just get practice with the different flexbox utilities so that you can achieve any layout you want. All right, let's copy the same treatment here over in our main area. We'll make this padding only in the X direction. We'll give this a fixed height. And we'll make this flex item center. We'll go ahead and copy this array treatment. And we'll call this message 1. Add some lorem ipsum text right here. And we'll add a bit of space between each message. And again, we can see the messages list is taking up extra space from the header, but as soon as we add overflow Y scroll, the header should get that space right back. So this is pretty cool. We have kind of these 3 independent scrollable panels, and each one is taking up kind of the extra space in the system exactly as we would expect. So the scrollable panels get the extra vertical space, and again, just like from the last video, this main area is taking up the extra horizontal space with our server and channel selectors being a fixed width. Let's start customizing our color palette by inspecting this screen from Discord. We'll start by looking at the server list over here, which has the darkest gray in the app. And I'll just come and find that background color, grab the hex code, and then let's pop over to Figma, and I'll just drop a rectangle in here and make the background color that dark gray. Now I'm going to keep going until we basically have all of the grays from the app. And once we do, we're going to end up with something like this. We can see I've pulled these 7 different grays from the backgrounds and text colors of the main Discord screen. Now, if you're starting a new project, have a chat with your designers up front about using a limited color scale. It'll make them happier because their designs will be perfectly implemented, and it'll make you happier because their designs will be easier for you to implement. Okay, so next we'll go ahead and arrange all of these 7 grays by their shade. Now, Tailwind's color scale has 10 values, which is a good amount to build a real-world UI. So I've gone ahead and arranged these from the darkest ones I found to the lightest, leaving some gaps for the missing values. And then we can go ahead and fill in those missing values ourselves. Unfortunately, there's no good automated way to do this, so we'll just use our eye to do our best. So now that we have all of our colors, let's go ahead and bring them into Tailwind. I'll bring code over to our screen with the browser. And here we can easily see Discord's color scheme and our current clone, which uses the defaults. So the colors are looking quite different. What we're going to do is open up our Tailwind config, where we see this default object with a theme key and extend. Now here we get to choose whether we want to restrict our colors to only the ones that we list out, or if we just want to extend Tailwind's defaults. So for this one, let's go ahead and extend the defaults. We're extending the colors module, and within that, the gray color. And right here, we can paste in our values from Figma. And just like magic, we can see all of our grays have been updated. So they're still a little bit off because we are using the wrong values. So let's come back to our index. The server selector here is gray 900. The channels are gray 800. The main area is 700. And the default text here is gray 100. And then our channel titles are text gray 300. But we also have this variant where we have an unread channel, which is going to be text white. So with those changes, we're a lot closer to matching the brand directly from Discord, and we're in a great spot to keep building out our UI. The great thing about this hundreds-based number scale is that it accommodates new colors if your designers come back with changes. So if you need a new shade between 600 and 700, you can just define a 650. And don't be afraid to use one-off colors here and there for parts of your UI that aren't really coupled to your design system. Things like callouts on marketing pages are a great use case for those. To customize our app's typography, we need to start by loading the fonts we want to use. Discord actually uses two fonts. One is Whitney for the base text, which we can see if we hover over one of these elements. This will show us that the base font is 16 pixels and Whitney. And then we have some title fonts here. Right here we're using Ginto. So over in our app, we'll add Ginto and Whitney, but because they're premium fonts, we'll also add Open Sans as an open source fallback. So the first step is to actually load the fonts. So I'll come over to my desktop where I have the fonts here, and then I'll just drop them right here in my project's public folder. And you can see we have 1 weight of Ginto and we have 4 weights of Whitney. Next, I'll create a styles.css file, and I'll paste in all the font face rules. Then, because this is a next project and I want these styles available globally, I'll just come over to my app.js and import my new style sheet. Now at this point, nothing's changed, but if we've wired this up correctly, we should be able to just drop a div right here and set the font family directly on the style attribute equal to Whitney and see a change right there. And indeed, it looks like Whitney is now rendering here. And similarly, if we were to use Ginto, we should also see that work as well. Now let's come over and make a new file called document, which is where we'll load our open source fallback. In Next.js, the base document looks like this, which just gives us a head tag here. And because the Open Sans font is on Google Fonts, all we need to do is just paste some link tags that we got straight from Google Fonts. And you can see right here, we're loading the Open Sans font. Now if we come back to our app and try out Open Sans, we should see yet another font right here. And indeed we do. So all 3 of our fonts are being loaded into our project now. There's lots of ways to load fonts depending on what tools you're using. But now that our fonts are loaded, we can actually customize Tailwind to consume those fonts. So the way to do this is to head on over to Tailwind config. And under theme extend, we're going to extend the font family module. Now by default, Tailwind applies the Sans font family to our whole site. So if we actually just overwrite this with Whitney, then like magic, we'll actually see all of this text default to Whitney. And that's exactly what we want, so that's a great starting point. Now, it's best practice to specify fallback fonts in case users can't get your preferred font for whatever reason, and we can do that in Tailwind's config using an array. So after Whitney, we'll go ahead and add Open Sans. And let's just say, you're not using Whitney and Ginto, or the user couldn't load it, so we'll just comment out this import as if these fonts weren't loaded. And we'll actually see here that now Open Sans is being rendered. And we can verify that by inspecting one of these elements, coming to computed, and seeing that the rendered font right here is actually Open Sans. So we'll go back to Whitney. And just to button this up, we actually want to add the rest of Tailwind's default Sans stack to the end of this list. Basically, we just want to append Whitney and Open Sans to the default stack. And we can do that by coming up here and importing the default theme directly from the Tailwind CSS npm package. And then down in our Sans declaration, we can splat the array of the default theme.fontfamily.sans. And now we're still seeing Whitney rendered, but to verify our fallbacks made it through to the actual CSS declaration, we can just take a look and see what the font family rule is for this element. And there we see it's Whitney first priority, then Open Sans, then UI Sans Serif, and the rest of the default stack. Okay, so we've updated the base font that's used for all of our text in our app, but we have one more font to add. So let's come back to our Tailwind config, and we'll just define a new key here. This can be whatever we want. Let's call it title since it's used really for titles in this app. And we'll basically do the same thing. We want to use Ginto first, Open Sans second, and because Ginto is a Sans font, we'll go ahead and grab the default Sans stack as well. Okay, so these keys give us the font sans and font title utility classes. We didn't have to explicitly use font sans because Tailwind applies it to the root. But if we go ahead and open our index page and find this piece of text right here, now we can add font title. So let's go ahead and add font title. And we can see right there, the IntelliSense has already picked up our custom key. And just like that, now we have Ginto as a title font in our app. And if we Alt-Tab back to Discord here, we can see our clone is starting to look much more like the real thing. It's pretty incredible how much of an effect these fonts have on your UIs. We can even see the server title in Discord is actually white. And the channel titles here are using a slightly bolder font weight. Let's try font medium. So again, just some tweaks to show you that, Tailwind is really an engine for creating your own app's design system. Here we are able to match this production app basically perfectly so far, but just because Tailwind ships with default values for typography doesn't mean you should be afraid to customize them on your own. Being able to tweak Tailwind exactly in the way you need for the UI that you're building is really one of my favorite things about Tailwind. To start improving our server selector, let's focus on just this first button here, the Discord button. So I'll come over and I'll just grab this div and I'll comment out all this dummy data right here. And we'll just start with one plain div. Now over in Discord, if we inspect this, we'll see that the background here is 36393F. And if we pop open our Tailwind config, we'll see that that is gray 700. So let's go ahead and change this background white to background gray 700. Looks good. Now we see that the inside of this is actually this Discord logo right here, which if we look in our inspector is this SVG icon. SVGs work great directly with Tailwind, so I'm actually just going to copy this icon directly from the inspector, and I'm going to use this little website that I like to use called transform.tools. We can just paste in our SVG right here, and this gives us a React component. Of course, you can use any tool you like to get an SVG into your app, but for this, we can just go ahead and paste this component right here in our project. I'll rename this to Discord icon. Go ahead and get rid of this class name, and we'll actually also delete the hard-coded width and height here. And now back in our clone, we can come up to this first button and go ahead and render the Discord icon inside of this div. So if we zoom in, we can actually see the Discord icon there, but it's a little dark and too big. First, let's fix the color. The color is actually coming from this text utility right here. So right now it's gray 800. I could make this text white, and we'll see that that makes the icon white. And that's actually because down here we're using the current color for the fill attribute on our path. This is a good property to use because it lets us style our SVG icons just using plain old color utilities from Tailwind. So we can make this red 500, and we'll see it's red, and so on. But if we pop over to Discord, and inspect the icon, we can take a look at the computed property here and see that the color is actually this DC DD DE color. So again, back in our Tailwind config, we can see that that corresponds to gray 100. So if we switch back to our clone and make this text gray 100, we should be matching that color perfectly. So now let's fix the size. If we take a look at this SVG, we can see that the size is 28 pixels wide by 20 pixels tall. We can actually come straight to our icon and add a class here. We want the width to be 7, which corresponds to 28 pixels. And we want the height to be 5, which corresponds to 20 pixels. And now our icon is sized perfectly. Okay, next let's take a look at the hover treatment. We'll see that when we hover in Discord, the color turns to this kind of brand indigo here, and the border radius changes as well. Let's start with this color. If we inspect, we can see that this color is 5865F2. So let's come over to our config, define a new brand color, and type in 5865F2. This will give us the Discord brand in our color palette, so we should be able to say hover background brand. Here's Discord, and here's our clone. Now finally, we'll also see that the Discord logo itself actually transitions to white on hover. So we can achieve that using hover text white. And now our colors look great. Okay, in Discord, we actually notice that the colors transition smoothly as we hover over the icon. Well, we can do that in our clone here as well, just by adding the transition class. And now we see that there's this subtle transition of our colors when we hover them. And if we take a look at this class, we'll see that this applies a transition to these common properties, and it gives us this nice default timing function along with a duration of 150 milliseconds. Now, 150 milliseconds actually feels a little bit fast compared to Discord, so we can tweak these defaults using other utilities. Let's go ahead and use the duration utilities to slow this down from 150 to 200. And yeah, I think that feels much better. Okay, now let's work on the border radius. We can see that in Discord it goes from this circle to this kind of nice rounded rectangle. And right now we're using rounded full for the circle. But Tailwind comes with a bunch of default rounded classes here. This one's a little bit too small, so let's take a look at what we have. We can go up to medium or large. This looks a little bit closer. Still too small. Extra large. And 2XL. 2XL looks spot on. So we actually want this to only apply on hover. We want to start with a circle and then apply that 2XL rounding on hover. So let's go back to rounded full, and then we'll say hover. We'll use rounded 2XL. Doesn't seem to be taking effect. Now this is happening because this hover prefix by default only applies to certain modules inside of Tailwind. We could fix this by going over to the config and configuring the hover variant to work with our border radius module, or we could actually just enable the just-in-time mode that comes with Tailwind in versions 2.1 or later. And we can do that by defining a new mode key here and just typing in JIT. So once Tailwind recompiles, we actually see that border radius taking into effect on the hover interaction. So the JIT mode is a really nice addition to Tailwind, and it saves us from having to configure a bunch of stuff that we used to have to do on our own. Now there's one more problem here. we see that the color is transitioning smoothly, but the border radius actually isn't. And that's because this default transition class only applies to this limited set of properties by default. But fortunately, there's another convenient class called transition all, which transitions all properties, which we can see just by hovering this right here. So this should actually apply our transition to the border radius. But something still seems off here. Let's pop open our inspector, and let's come and take a look at the Animations tab. If we go ahead and hover over our button, slow this down to 10%, and then click on this animation, we can actually grab this handle and take a closer look. So it's clear that our colors are transitioning smoothly, and it looks like the border radius is doing something here. And then as we get towards the end, we can actually see it kind of working, but it's definitely not doing what we expect. Now the reason for this is that our rounded full class, the way this is implemented is actually by setting the border radius to 9,999 pixels. And this is just so that when applied, this utility would make any element a perfect circle. So transitioning from this super high value just down to 16 pixels, which is what rounded to XL gives us, is not going to work right for our transitions. What we really want to do is transition just enough to make this a perfect circle so that our animations line up. So if we take away the rounded full, we'll go back to this square. And what we need to do is figure out exactly how many pixels we need to make this a perfect circle. Well, we know that the width and height of this is 48 pixels because we're setting it right here using these two utility classes. So half of 48 is 24. 24 pixels should do the trick. Let's take a look at the included rounded utilities here. And lo and behold, rounded 3XL corresponds to 24 pixels. So if we apply rounded 3XL and save this, we're back to a perfect circle. But now when I hover this, we get that nice smooth transition, which actually looks pretty dang close to what is in Discord. So this is pretty neat that we were able to recreate this just using the Tailwind utilities that are included out of the box. So our server link is looking good, but we'll notice over in Discord, these links actually have two states. One when they're inactive and we see the hover treatment, and then again when they're active, this active indicator goes full height and we don't have the hover effects anymore. So to get started on these details, we need to add another server icon to our clone. So let's start by copying our Discord link, and we'll just put in S1 for server 1 like this. And we can see right now it kind of has the same treatment as our first one. Now we want to make these links to actual pages. So for that, we'll need a new page for server 1 here. So let's come over and create a new page, servers1.js. And for now, we'll just export this simple paragraph tag. Now to actually link to this page from our server nav here, we can come back to our home page, go ahead and import link from next link, wrap our new div inside of a link with an href of /servers/1, and then turn this div into an a tag. And with any luck, we should be able to click this and see our new page. And if we pop open the address bar, we can see here the URL has changed. Now the problem is we've lost our persistent server navigation here. So we actually want to hoist some of our code here to our root app component so that it can serve as layout code. So let's grab this root div along with our server selector, copy that, and then over in _app, we can find the page component right here, paste in our layout code with another closing div, and let's go ahead and move our page component inside of the layout. Now we see we need to grab our Discord item, so let's come back to our index, copy our icon, and let's also come and grab the link import and paste that up here. Okay, so we can see our layout here is being rendered twice. That means over in our home page, we actually don't need any of this layout code. And our root div doesn't need to be this flex height screen anymore. So we can just go ahead and delete that, remove the link, and remove this Discord icon. So now our app looks good again. And if we click this link, we actually see our page here inside of the layout. Let's finish up by turning our first button here into a link to the home page, and we'll just repeat the same process. Wrap this in a link, give it an href of /, and turn this div into an a tag. And now both links work, and this means that we're ready to use the current URL to conditionally apply styles to each one of these server links in our nav. So to try this out, let's come back to our app, import the useRouter hook from nextRouter, and we'll go ahead and get the router right here. And then we'll come down to our anchor tag, turn this class name into an expression, and change these quotes to backticks so that we can use dynamic variables for our class name here. Now, if we embed an expression and we check whether the router.path name is equal to /, well, that means we're on the home page. So we'll apply these classes. Otherwise, we'll apply these classes. And now we can move our hover classes here, which we only want to apply in the inactive state, to this second block. And we also want this text gray 100 and this background gray 700 and this rounded class as well. So now we've moved kind of the particular parts of our treatment for the inactive state to the second half of this ternary expression. So with any luck, when we're on servers 1, we see our original treatment. But when we click the home link, all that goes away. And now we can actually just apply the actual active treatment based on what's in Discord. And that's basically going to be these three classes that we're using with the hover prefix in the inactive state. So we want rounded 2XL, background brand, and text white. Save that, come back to our clone, and now we have the inactive state and then the active state. And now this is really starting to feel much more like an app. Let's finish up our Discord button here by building the active indicator, and we'll start when our button is inactive. To build this, we'll use an absolutely positioned div right here. So let's come back to our clone and start just by turning this anchor tag into a div, wrapping it with an A, and we'll make this anchor tag relative, and we'll add a new absolute div right here. And this will be our bar. So in Discord, it's kind of this white bar over here. Let's just start by making it background white, and we'll give it a width of 2 and a height of 2. And there we can kind of see the beginning of our status indicator. Now we need to move this over, and we can position absolute elements using utilities like top1 to move it down from the top, top2 to move it further, or even left1 and left2. And this offsets the element from the left side. But we can actually stick a negative sign right in front of this to invert this value. So left1 moves it over by 1 unit on the spacing scale, left2 2 units, and so on. And the cool thing about Tailwind's spacing scale is that all these spacing utilities use the same values. So we can see right here that we're using a padding of 3 units to account for this space right here. So if we make this negative left 3, our bar lines up perfectly with the left side of the screen. Now we want the status bar here to center in our button just like it does in Discord. And my favorite way to center anything in CSS is with flexbox. So let's go ahead and make a flex parent, and we'll pull the absolute class and the negative left 3 class up here. And then let's come over here and inspect our new container. Now for this to work, this will need to actually fill the whole height of our link button right here. But if we hover over our link, we'll see it's not really taking up space in the DOM the way we expect. And that's because we're using an A tag, which is inline. So if we make this block, now we'll see when we hover this, this is actually taking up this full space. So with any luck, if we make this height of 100%, we can see now that this is a full height. So let's come over to our flex container, make it height full. And now we should just be able to use item center to center that bar. And it works. Now let's work on the size of the bar. Over in Discord, we see it's a little bit narrower. So width 2, let's bring this down to width 1. And yeah, that looks pretty good. And then for the height, well, it's a little hard to match right now because in Discord, these corners are rounded. Now, if we just come here and add rounded to our bar, this is not going to work because it's rounding all 4 corners. But fortunately, we can use the rounded R class to round just the right side. And now we're back in business. So let's increase the height here a little bit. 3, 4, still a little short, 5, and 5 seems to do the trick. Okay, now let's work on this hover treatment. We can see in Discord when we hover the button, the indicator here kind of scales out and fades out, and then it scales up and fades in when we mouse over the button. So let's get the fading out working first. We can use opacity 0, hover opacity 100. And now when we hover the bar, we see it kind of pops in. But it's not fading in. We can achieve that easily using transition all and duration 200 to match our treatment down here on the button. And now we have this kind of nice fade in effect. But of course, in Discord, the bar doesn't fade in when we hover over the bar. It fades in when we hover over this link. Fortunately, Tailwind has our back here. If we want to trigger a class when we hover over some parent element, we give that parent element the group class, in this case our anchor tag, and then we just change this hover to group hover. And that's going to be all we need to do to actually trigger this to fade in. So now we can see when our button transitions, our bar fades in as well. And you'll actually notice there's a little discrepancy here. When we hover over this link, which takes up all this space, we're getting the fade in effect on our bar, but we're not getting the transition on our button. And that's because the hover classes on this div are just using hover. If we switch them to group hover, that should fix that as well. And so now if we hover any part of this parent link, we get everything fading in and transitioning nicely, just like you'll see happen in Discord. Okay, the next part is this scaling effect. We'll see that the active indicator here kind of scales down towards the left when we mouse away from the button. Well, we can achieve that pretty easily using Tailwind's scale utilities. So let's start it off at scale 0. And when we have the group hover, we'll apply scale 100. And now this is kind of scaling in and out. And it looks almost right, but there's something a little off. If we come here and find duration 200 and slow this down just a little bit, we'll see that as this is scaling, it's actually scaling about the middle of the container. And that's not what we want. We want that left side to hug the left side of the page. This is because the transform origin by default is the center, but we want it to be left. So we can use origin left to set the transform origin here to left. And now if we hover over this, we'll see that this is working exactly like we expect. So let's change this duration 1000 back to 200. And now this is looking really nice. Okay, now let's work on the active state. So in Discord, once we click this button, we see the height of the bar basically grows a little bit and it transitions smoothly, just like that. So let's do the same thing we did before and use an expression here for our class name so we can apply different styles based on whether this button is active or not. So I'll come here, turn this into an expression, and turn these into template strings. So we can use our variable here, and we'll say router.pathname is equal to the home route. We'll apply some classes, otherwise apply some other classes. And let's just grab all the classes for our inactive state. So we know the height is going to be 5. We want the scale to be 0. And then we want the opacity, the group hover opacity, and the group hover scale to come along here as well. And so if we take a look at this, we should have our inactive state back. But when we click on this, the bar goes away because we have no height. We can get it back to 5, but that's not quite right. Let's bump it up to 8, 9, and 10. Looks spot on. So now we've got the hover treatment here. And then we click, and look at that. The bar grows just like Discord. Okay, there's one final detail we're missing. Notice in Discord, when we hover and click, if our mouse is pressed down, we get this little nudge downwards, and then we let go, and it nudges back. Our clone doesn't have this yet, but we can achieve this using the translate utilities that come with Tailwind. Now, we don't want the bar to go down, which is what we've been working on here. So let's find the actual button. And right here at the end, let's add translate y. And this utility uses all the same values from the spacing scale. So let's just try 1. And you'll see that that kind of nudges our button down. Now, we only want this to take effect when the user is actually clicking on the button. So when the mouse is actively being pressed. And this corresponds to a pseudo class in CSS called active, which we can use via the active prefix. So just like that, now we have this where when we click on it, the button translates down. Okay, just a few more tweaks. First, we want that nudge to apply if we're clicking the link right here, not just this button. So let's go ahead and make this a group active. And now we see it nudges down, even if we're kind of outside of the bounds of the button. Second, if we pop over to Discord, we'll see this nudge is much smaller than our current nudge here. But fortunately, Tailwind has a few values below 1, including a pixel value, which is just going to give us a 1 pixel nudge. And that looks a lot closer. Now, the final detail is that our nudge is actually transitioning because of this transition all class, whereas in Discord, it's just an instant nudge. So let's fix this by just wrapping this button in a new div and moving our class here up to this new div. And since this doesn't have any transition on it, it should just give us an immediate nudge. And it does. That looks really dang close. And we've only used the default classes that come with Tailwind. So this is pretty cool. Let's take one more look zoomed out here. We'll take a look at the inactive state in Discord. And then over in our clone. Looks really good. And then when we go from inactive to active, it looks like this. And then in our clone. So that is pretty awesome. I'm always surprised with just how far I can get using the default utilities that come with Tailwind, and we haven't even had to write a single line of custom CSS yet. Now you might be wondering about how best to maintain all this new markup that we've created to kind of work well with Tailwind's composable utility classes, and we'll be covering that in the next episode. So we've seen how easy it is to use Tailwind's utilities to build this custom UI, but now we have all this markup. And if we want to repeat our treatment, we're going to have to duplicate it. And we can see that this gets pretty unwieldy pretty quickly. Now, unlike other CSS frameworks, Tailwind doesn't attempt to solve this problem of code duplication itself. Instead, it encourages us to use whatever tools for code reuse that we already have within the framework that we're already using to build our app. Well, this is a React app, and the primary tool for code reuse is a component. So let's come down here and create a nav link component. and we'll just return this markup that we have from last time. Now up here, we can render a nav link, and let's start to fill this out. So first, we'll want to pass in the href so we can use this with different links. So we'll make that a prop here, use it for our link components href, and we'll also change this to use the prop as well. Now this component needs access to the router, so we can just come up here and grab it and then paste it in our new component. Now finally, we don't want to hard code this Discord icon inside of our navlink component because these are going to be different. So let's pass this in as children here. I'll just copy this. And down in our component, we'll render children instead. And we'll just grab this from our props. So with any luck, we should see our second nav link here, and it has exactly the same treatment. And we can see if we're on the home route, it is indeed active. It's tied to the URL, and so that's all working nicely. So let's go ahead and delete this link. And let's replace this with nav link, and we'll just pass in S1 for the label. Now we'll see the same treatment here, and this one is tied to server/1. So just with a simple component here, we've already solved the duplication problem with all the markup we have, without sacrificing any of the composability or the ease of use of Tailwind's APIs. If we need to change something, we can just come and change it directly here in the markup, and that's going to propagate through all of our uses of navlink. Now let's come over and take a look at Discord. We'll see that there is a little divider here between kind of the dashboard and the first server. So let's go ahead and add that to our clone. I'll drop an HR in here. And now let's match the color. If I inspect this and take a look, we'll see the color is this white with a 6% opacity. So over in our clone, we can add a class name to this HR. And this is styled using border top. So we can change the color with border T and then white to make it pure white. Now to add opacity to this color, we can actually use a little shortcut here, just a slash. And you'll see here, there's some values like 30%, but we want 6. And 6 is not included in kind of the default scale. It goes down to 0 and 5. But because we're using the JIT compiler, we can use this bracket syntax to put in any value that we want. So we'll just put in 0.06, and now we've matched that color perfectly. Now Discord's bar is a little bit taller, so let's use border T, and then we'll go up to 2 for 2 pixels. The corners here are rounded, so let's make it rounded. And then it looks like there's a little bit of margin on either side, so we can use margin X for both margin left and right. Let's try MX1. A little bit too short. MX2. And that does the trick. All right, let's zoom back out. And let's start working on these actual server images. So I have these images right here on my desktop. I'll just come and grab them and then throw them into our public directory. And here we see Tailwind, Next, and Mirage .pngs. So over here, back in our app, instead of just writing S1, we can drop in an image tag and point it to servers tailwind.png. Okay, it looks like our rounding is not taking effect. I think all we need to do here is come to our div with the rounding and just add an overflow hidden. And that should take care of it. And so check that out. We've gotten this working with this completely new child that we're passing in here. This one has a Discord icon, but here we're putting in an image, and our treatment is working perfectly. Let's go ahead and delete this use router because we don't need that anymore. And let's spruce up this page a little bit. So I'll come to our home page. I'll grab this, and we'll just go to servers 1 here. Call this the server page, and I'll just call this server 1 for now. so that we can actually see this full layout. And then back on our home page, let's just call this dashboard. Let's change general to friends. Let's get rid of these channels. And let's just get rid of all this content right here. Okay, so now we've got the home page, server 1. And now what I want to do is make this server page dynamic. So we don't only have one, we can have many different server pages. So the way we do this in Next is just to come over here and rename this 1.js to a variable. We'll call it SID for server ID using brackets. And then we can come and grab the router from use router. And right here, instead of server 1, we'll render router.query.sid. And this is going to point to this variable that is from the URL. So now server/1 works, but if we go to server/2, that works as well. So now we can put any number here for a dynamic server page. Okay, so our home button still works. And if we visit server 1, we'll see we've actually broken the active state. Let's come back to our app and come down here and take a look at this router. If we pop open the console and we take a look at this, we'll see that we're using path name, which now that we have a dynamic page is actually pointing to this file right here. And that's not going to resolve to the same thing in the URL. What we actually want is as path, which is going to include that variable right there. So all we should need to do is change this check from path name to as path to determine whether we should conditionally apply these classes when the URL is active. And there we go. We can see that it fixed it. And now we have our nav link working again, even if I swipe back and forward or use the forward and back buttons. Okay, now for the fun part. Let's close this sidebar, close these pages, and up here in the top of our app, I'm just going to paste in some server data, which points to the 3 images in our servers folder. And now for our nav links, let's go ahead and grab the servers and call .map for each server and render a nav link for each one. We'll change these quotes to backticks, make this an expression, and render the server ID right here. And we'll change these to backticks, use brackets, and render the server.image right here. And this is specific to React. We also want a key prop here. This just lets React keep track of which nav link is which. So if we save that, with any luck, we're going to have 3 server indicators here. I'll get server 1, server 2, and server 3. And notice that this treatment is all working exactly how we expect. Again, I can swipe forward and back. I can use the back buttons. Everything's derived from the URL state. We're rendering the images, and this is pretty cool. I mean, we're matching this thing basically pixel for pixel here. Again, we have not had to step out of our markup at all. This just shows the power of how productive you can be staying in the markup and really embracing Tailwind's composable classes here. And note that we haven't had to go outside of React's paradigm at all. The only thing we had to name was this navlink, but we didn't have to come up with a bunch of classes like navlink wrapper or container and explain any CSS architecture decisions to the rest of our teammates. This is just a good old bread and butter React component. Any React dev who's working on this project will be able to take a look at it and understand how it works. And so this is really the best way to kind of manage the coupling between your classes and your markup. It's just to embrace whatever abstraction you already have for code reuse. And you can see here, we have no more duplication on this page. The first thing different about our server header is the shadows. Over in Discord, we see that they're using this tighter shadow. And it turns out there's 3 that come from Discord that don't line up really well with Tailwind's defaults. So this is a case where we actually don't want to use any of Tailwind's default shadows. And for that reason, I'm going to come over to Tailwind config, and above extend, I'm just going to paste in the values directly from Discord. We're just going to use 3 small, medium, and large so that they all match perfectly. So now we can come to our server page, And in this case, we have shadow medium right here and right here. We just want to change this to shadow small. And you'll see that now this matches perfectly. You'll also notice that our IntelliSense updates with only the shadow values that we have. So this should help your team know which values are available. Okay, now let's work on this verified icon. I went ahead and copied the icons we'll be using into this components folder. We're already using the Discord icon, and the rest I copied directly from Discord, just like we saw earlier in the course. All of them are just copy pasted and run through transform tools. So we have everything we need right here. Now in this case, we actually have two icons, this verified icon and then the check icon. So we'll be using both of those right here before our server title. So let's grab the verified icon and the check icon. And those we can import from our components folder. And there we can see them being rendered. Now, if we take a look at Discord, we'll see that these icons are 16 by 16. So we can just throw a class name on each of these, width 4 and height 4 for 16 pixels. Okay, now for the colors. This flower start icon is this background accent variable, which is 4F545C. Now, this is actually not in our grayscale. It's something I missed when I did my original audit. But if this happens to you in a real world project that your design contains a color outside of the scale you've already agreed on with your designers, it's a good time to have a conversation with the design team, make sure that choice was intentional, and if not, maybe rework the scale or use a different color. But in our case, we're just going to go ahead and slot this right in here at 550. And this is one of the things I like about this numeric scale is this flexibility. So now we can go ahead and make this text gray 550, and we'll leave the check icon white. Okay, the colors are correct. The icons sit on top of each other, so why don't we just wrap these in a relative div and then make these absolute. Now this removes this div from the flow. Let's go ahead and give it a width and a height of 4 as well, so it's taking up space again, and that's looking much better. Now it looks like over in Discord we have a little bit more horizontal padding right here. So that's coming from px3. Let's switch this to 4. That looks spot on. And let's add a little bit of margin right to our icon. We'll use this wrapper div, throw an MR1 here, and this looks great. Okay, now let's change the title to Tailwind CSS for now. We'll just hard code this in here. And if we compare this, we can actually see that Discord's title is a little bit smaller here. And if we inspect it, we'll see it has a font size of 15 pixels. Now 15 actually falls outside of Tailwind's defaults, but in this case, if you audit the CSS from Discord, 15 is only used a handful of times. So instead of updating our global Tailwind config, I'm just going to come here to where our other typography rules are, and we're just going to use the JIT compiler to add a little one-off class here. So we can use text, and here we can see base is 16, small is 14, but we're just going to go 15 pixels using the brackets to get us just the right value. And now that is matching perfectly. All right, last thing is this chevron icon. So let's come right here and throw in the chevron icon. If we inspect this, it's 18 by 18. And again, if we look at width 4, we get 16. Width 5 gives us 20. So we're right in between. Let's again just use a one-off value of 18 pixels for the width and the height here so that this matches perfectly. So there it is. It's pushed up against our text. So because we're in a flex container, we can use margin left auto to push it to the right. And last thing, we'll notice here that the opacity is actually 80%. We can do that with the opacity 80 utility. So that's looking great. Okay, before we wrap up, we have a little hover treatment here. If we come up to the header and give it a hover pseudo class, we'll see it's using this background modifier hover. And this color is 4F5, Tailwind config, which we do have. It's that new 550 again. But we'll also notice that it has an opacity of 16%. So let's come back to our page. And this wrapper div right here, since this is going to be interactive, let's make it a button. And then we'll say hover background gray 550. And we can use a shortcut to add some opacity. Now the defaults here go 5, 10, and 20. But again, if we wanted to match this, let's go ahead and use the brackets for 0.16. And now we have the hover treatment, and it matches perfectly here. Finally, we'll notice there's just a little bit of transition, so we can add that with the transition class. And now our header's looking really nice. Looks just like Discord's. So when it comes to these arbitrary values, there's no hard and fast rule. They're a good opportunity to have a conversation with your design team if you find yourself using values that weren't in your palette that you kind of agreed upon at the beginning. But definitely don't be scared to use the arbitrary one-off rules with the bracket syntax. That's exactly what it's here for. It keeps you in the HTML, and it keeps you productive working within Tailwind's paradigms. Now that we have the header built, let's start working on these channels. So that would be this div right here. Let's start by deleting these dummy channels, and then take a look at Discord. So we've got this book icon, and then we have the welcome channel. So let's just start with a div. We'll go ahead and import our book icon from our icons folder, and we'll write welcome. Okay, so our icon's rendering. It's a little bit big. So we can pop open the inspector, take a look at this SVG, and we see it's 20 by 20. So that'll be width 5 by height 5. And let's go ahead and make this a flex with item center. Okay, let's get the colors of these right. This icon right here is 727. I actually just learned we can shift click this so that we can see it right there. And that gives us a value in Tailwind of gray 400. We can see that right from our config. So let's make the icon text gray 400. And then for the actual text right here, we can also shift click and see that this is 8E92, which is 300. So we'll make this wrapper div text gray 300, just like that. And that looks good. Okay, so to get the spacing of this to match, let's go ahead and remove this outer padding. We have that on this wrapper div right here. But when I look at interfaces like this, I used to put kind of wrapping padding around the whole thing, but these are really kind of independent, and it usually helps with building out the hover treatment if we just treat them like that and remove this wrapping padding. So I'm going to remove this and also the space wide 2 that was just from earlier. And now let's see if we can get these to line up. So let's start with just px2 right here. Seems like we need a little bit more over. So let's try 3 or 4. That looks pretty close. And now let's push it down. Usually when I push things down, I start with just margin top because this kind of just operates on the top of the element and we don't make any assumptions about what follows yet. So let's just start with margin top right here. That's 3. Looks like we need to jump a little bit to 5 maybe. And that's pretty close. If we look at this book icon, we're off just a little bit. Now I used to do some tricks like adding a pixel of padding right here, and that looks like it lines up the book perfectly. But with the just in time, let's keep it simple. Change this MT5, which is 20 pixels, and we'll just make it 21 pixels for now. And so that book icon looks spot on. So now we can add a little bit of margin to the right of the book icon. So we'll come here, MR1, looks a little small. 2 is a little bit big. So fortunately down here we have some half sizes. 1.5 is included in Tailwind, and that makes it line up perfectly. Okay, now let's take a look at this hover treatment. So we can see that this element actually takes up this amount of space kind of conceptually in this layout. So let's see if we can get that all lined up. First, let's change this div into an anchor tag, because this is really a link. And let's figure out what that background color is. We can scroll up here to this icon visibility div, click hover, and now we can see that this is our 4F5 class, which is the 550 that we added. And we saw it also has that 16% opacity. So this is actually exactly the same treatment that we gave our header right here. We should just be able to grab this class, come down to our A, and drop it in right here. So now we've got the color, but our size is a little bit off here. So first, in the X direction, we want this to only have a little bit of padding. So let's drop this down maybe to PX2 and then add an MX2. That way our channel link is still lined up perfectly, but we see that the padding only goes out to here, and that looks like it lines up perfectly. And then we also want some padding in the Y direction. So I'm just going to grab this MT21 and stick it up here on this kind of wrapper div. That should preserve the actual position of the text, and we see it does. And then we can add some vertical padding right here. Let's add PY2. Now, of course, that's going to push this down because there's 8 extra pixels of space right here. So we can just drop this down by 8 pixels to 13 so that these still sum up to 21. And let's take a look at this. So it looks like the vertical padding's a little bit less. Let's go down to PY1, add back in 4 pixels right here to 17. And now these look spot on. We'll also see that there's a little bit of rounding right here in the corners. And we can achieve that just by adding the rounded class. So that looks pretty good. Now when we hover over in Discord, we have some color changes here. This text brightens up a little bit. If we take a look, we can see it's DCDD, which is gray 100. So down on our anchor, we'll say hover text gray 100. And that looks just right. And then finally, we have this person icon for creating an invite. So let's take care of that. We'll come right after our welcome text and drop in the add person icon. There it is. Let's take a look at how big this is. So if we find this SVG, we can see it's 16 by 16. So class name equals with 4 height 4. Should do the trick. Now it's small, but we want to push it over, and because we're in a flex container, we can just use margin left auto, and it'll push it all the way to the right. Now the color here looks to be a little bit brighter than what we have, so I'm guessing it's one step down. We can see it's B9, which is gray 200, so we can say this is text gray 200. And now it looks just right. So we're matching the style, but our interaction isn't quite right, because if we disable this hover, we'll see that these only show up in Discord when you actually hover them, otherwise they're invisible. And we've already learned how to do that. We want to make it so that this shows up when we hover this element. That means we need to make this a group so that we can come down here and say, let's start out with opacity 0 to hide this. And then when we hover the group using the group hover pseudo class, let's go ahead and set the opacity to 100. And now when we hover any part of our anchor tag here, this little guy shows up. Now finally, when we hover this, we get a tooltip, which we're not going to take care of right now, but when we hover the icon, we see it brightens up just a little bit. Let's come back, enable the hover on the container. Go ahead and grab this SVG. And here, when I hover this, you'll see that it gives us the new style. So we can actually shift click this, see that it's DCD, which is gray 100. So we should be able to say hover text gray 100. And if we come over and see how this compares to Discord with our clone, that looks just right. Now, one thing you'll notice is that when I clicked the hover pseudo class here in CSS, the tooltip didn't show up. And there might be times where you encounter this in code. Maybe you wanted to actually see what the styles were like on this tooltip. In our case, we were able to use just this hover state, but what if we wanted to inspect this, but it disappears when we move our mouse? I just want to show you a little trick because this comes up sometimes. You can click the sources pane right here, which activates kind of the JavaScript portion of the DevTools. And you'll see right here that there's a button called pause script execution. Now there's actually a keyboard shortcut for this, which is F8. So what I'm going to do is hover over this icon, go ahead and hit F8 on my keyboard, and you'll see it says paused in debugger. Well, the cool thing about this is we can come back and select the selector tool right here, and I can actually interact with this page, and the JavaScript that dismisses this tooltip won't get run, which lets us interact with this page and select all these new UI elements. So if we wanted to see what that color was, we can see right here, we get right back to that, the DCDD or our gray 100. But we could also search for this create invite tooltip. Now you'll see in this case, it's actually hard to select under these other elements, but we can just come here to the DevTools, command find for create invite. And once we search through a few of these, we'll land right here at these divs and these elements making up this. And now we can inspect all these colors. So that was just a little tip I wanted to share kind of while we were in this interactive part of the UI. But once you're done, you can hit play and the JavaScript starts executing again. And now we have this really nice channel header that looks exactly like Discord's. So let's go ahead and copy this for the announcements here. I'm just going to grab the A tag, duplicate this, change this to announcements. And then instead of a book icon, we actually have this speakerphone icon. And so back in our clone, we see the announcements button here with the same treatment. But the spacing is a little bit off. We can see it's jumping around a little bit. And for something like this, thinking about the layout, I actually like to think about space in between these and in between these as kind of their own conceptual elements. So what I'm going to do is wrap these two links in a new div. And we're going to use this handy space Y utility from Tailwind. And this is going to do exactly what it says. It's just going to put space in between each one of these channels. We only need a little bit, so let's start with space 1. That gives us 4 pixels. That looks like a little bit too much. So let's drop it down to 0.5. And yeah, that lines up perfectly. And the cool thing about this is, you know, it applies to every element that's a child of itself. So if we had a third channel, this should line up just perfectly, duplicating this exact markup that we have here. And because, you know, Discord is a dynamic app, this is kind of how you want to think about building UIs like this. But this treatment works just great. We've got our first 2 channels here. And in the next video, we're going to keep going with the rest of the sidebar. Now that we have 2 channels here, let's keep working on filling out the rest of the sidebar. And we're going to start with this Tailwind CSS category title. So our current div that wraps our first 2 channels is right here. We can start with a new one right down here. And we'll make this category title a button. And we'll call it Tailwind CSS. We also have this arrow icon right in front of it. And if we come over and take a look at this, we'll see this SVG is 12 by 12. So we can slap on a width 3 and height 3, just like that. And we'll make this a flex and item center. Okay, so our button's rendering. If we take a look at the typography here, we'll see that this is 12 pixels, and actually it's Argento font, which is our title font that we added earlier in the course. So we can come to our button, use text extra small for 12 pixels, and we'll use font title to get Ginto. And that's looking pretty good. Now these category titles are actually all in uppercase, and Tailwind has a class for that. It's called uppercase. So that takes care of that. Now let's work on the spacing here. Looks like we want to push it down a little bit. Let's just start with a little bit of margin top here. Maybe MT4. Looks like a little bit more, MT5. And let's throw a little bit of padding on this, maybe PX1 for padding in the horizontal direction. Okay, that arrow is over a little bit too far, so let's switch this down to 0.5. And it looks like we need to push it down just a tad more. 5 is 20 pixels, so let's go with 21 for now. And yeah, now that arrow looks like it's lining up perfectly, and we need a little bit of margin right on our arrow icon. One looks like a little bit too much. Let's try 0.5. And now the beginning of the T in Tailwind is lining up great, but you'll actually notice the text here feels a little bit more stretched out, and that's actually a typographic technique that affects the letter spacing. Well, Tailwind has a class called tracking, which we can use to adjust the letter spacing CSS property. And we have 6 default values here. So let's go ahead and make this just a little bit wider using the tracking wide utility class. And we can see that kind of stretched out these letters a little bit. And yeah, that's looking really nice. Okay, so now we want to get these next 4 channels in, and these have the same treatment as our first 2. So why don't we grab this div with the spacing, come down right below our button, and just paste this in. Now these are going to actually use the hashtag icon, so we'll grab that. And we'll change this to general plugins, and then we'll make 2 more copies for help and internals. Okay, those new channels are rendering. We see we need a little bit more vertical space right here. So we'll just come to this. Let's try MT1. A little bit off. Let's try 5 pixels and see how that works. Okay, and that is pixel perfect. So what I'm going to do now is open this data.json file that I put in the root of the repo here. And this contains all of the categories and channels in the actual Discord. And we're going to be able to render our UI from this data, kind of simulating fetching data from a backend server. So we can just pop up to the top here. Let's go ahead and get rid of this router and use router and import data from data.json. And what we want to do is identify the repeated patterns. So we'll ignore welcome and announcements for now, but basically every category we have this title, and then we have the channels, and we see that repeats a few times here. And that all starts with this div. So taking a look at data, why don't we actually bring this right down here just so we can see. We'll see I put the data under this 1 key because we're on servers/1. And so I'm going to come right here and we can say data1.categories. And this is going to give us each of the category names. We see the first one has no label, but then we have Tailwind CSS, Tailwind Labs, and so on. So the way we kind of loop over data in React is to use .map. And this will give us each category. So then we can use an arrow function. And at this point, we basically just want to move this whole chunk of HTML right inside this loop. We'll go ahead and give this div a key of category.id. And now we can replace this with dynamic data. So each category has a label. So we'll say category.label. And then here where we render all the channels for that category, we can go ahead and grab those directly off of each category because there's a channels property. So inside of this div, we'll say category.channels. And then we'll call .map again. This time we have a channel. And then we can just slot one of these A tags in just like that, and we'll get rid of the rest because we don't need these anymore. Let's go ahead and key each anchor tag by the channel's ID and replace the text here with channel.label. Okay, now we can see all of these channels are rendering from the data. Let's go ahead and get rid of our first two because we should be able to repeat these using our loops down here. And we see that we're rendering kind of an empty button because the first category doesn't have a label, just like it doesn't in Discord. So we can just conditionally render this button in React by checking whether we have a category.label. And if we do, we'll go ahead and render a button. Okay, so we've got the channels here, but we have a little bit of a spacing issue. You'll see we were using this margin top 21 pixels to take care of the spacing in between each category right here and so on. But we want to use the same technique we already used where we use the space Y utilities, since that only puts space in between siblings and not above the first one. So let's come up to here where we're wrapping each one of these categories, and we'll just throw a space Y 21 pixels, just like that. And that means we can knock it off of this button. So that took care of that little bit of margin. We still have this margin 17, which looks to be a little bit too much. Let's bring this down. 14, 12, and 12 seems to bring it back in right in place. So that means we can just replace this with MT3. Okay, all of our channels are lining up pretty perfectly here. The only thing we lost was these unique icons for the welcome and announcements because we're just rendering this hashtag icon in our loop. But we'll see down here in our fake data that these two channels have this custom icon property which we can use to render a different icon. So in order to do this in React, we're actually going to change how we import these icons. Instead of importing them all individually like this, I'm just going to delete these and say import star as icons from our component icons. And this is going to give me a single map or object here where the icons are all keys. So if I go and find all of these icons and just say icons.verified icon, we'll see that that properly renders our icons again. And this is just kind of nice because it's just a native JavaScript way to import basically a collection of named imports from a module. And so now that we have this kind of icons namespace, the extra icon feels a little redundant. So why don't we just clean this up with a quick refactoring. We'll change these to remove that suffix, and then we can grab all of these, delete icon from the end, and we'll also pop over to our underscore app where we're using the Discord icon and just change this to Discord for now. And now we have this nice little API. We can just say icons.icon_name to render an icon. This is going to help us with our dynamic channel icon. So now what we want to do, just close this, is move this channel link into its own component. Function channel link. We'll just come up and grab this HTML, return it from our channel link, and render a channel link instead. We can see that this channel link needs the channel information here, so we'll pass that in as a prop. And then we'll go ahead and key this again by channel.id. So this component now gives us an isolated space where we can actually use a variable called icon to set up a dynamic icon for each link. So if the channel, which is the JSON coming from the server, has an icon property, then our icon will be icons channel.icon. Otherwise, we'll use the default of icons.hashtag. And now instead of rendering this icons.hashtag, we'll just render our new dynamic icon component. And with any luck, we should see these two book and speakerphone icons, which we do. And now look at that. We have this whole sidebar filled with dynamic data, matching just great with Discord. Looks like we have a little bit of a scroll issue here, probably because we're using margin. So let's go ahead and switch this to padding, and that should take care of that. So this is pretty neat, and I just kind of want to step back here and take a look at what we ended up with. Because when we were starting this, we had a lot of duplication with all the channels that we wrote. And, you know, your spidey sense might be going off saying this is a lot of CSS classes, a lot of duplication. We should probably start extracting some classes or extracting some components. But as you saw, just through the process of generating this UI dynamically from server data, a lot of times you'll just take care of the duplication without even thinking about it. And so one thing I really want you to take away from this course is that if you're new to Tailwind, you might have an urge to dry up your code to remove that duplication prematurely. And you might look at some of your templates, see a lot of classes, and feel like it's going to be hard to maintain. But you know, after just a few days or weeks of working with Tailwind, you'll actually find a lot of duplication takes care of itself, and having all these classes co-located with the templates and components that are using them, keeping them there, not extracting them out to a separate file or a separate abstraction, actually makes your code way more maintainable. To style the active and inactive states of these channel links, we'll need the links themselves to actually change the URL. And right now in our clone, the only links we have are these server links, which change this part of the location. So we want to introduce another dynamic segment to our URL hierarchy so that when we click on these channels, we get another param right up here. And ultimately, we want this URL to look something like /server/1/channels/1, and that way we can navigate to different channels. So the way we do this sort of nested routing in Next is to nest these dynamic segments. So what we're going to do is put this page under a folder called SID and then channels, and then we'll call this page cid.js for channel ID. We'll see that VS Code updated our import path. So if we save this and then visit this new URL, we'll see we have our page rendered again. And so this is sort of how it works in Next. Now, every time we visit this URL, we'll have access to both of these dynamic segments via the SID and CID router params. So let's close the sidebar and turn off wrapping here and come down to our channel link. And to make these actually link to their respective channels, we need to wrap this anchor tag in a link tag. And for this link, we can go ahead and import this from next link. We can drop the key here. We didn't need that. And we'll also remove the href and put it on this link tag. And this will be an expression to something like server/1/channel/1. And now we can click these and we'll see it's actually rendering a link here, which we can tell because Chrome is showing us the new URL. But of course, we want this channel to be dynamic. So we'll just throw in our channel.id that we're getting from this channel link prop right here. And now with any luck, we can click on these different channels and we can see, in fact, the URL is changing. We can use the back button and change that as well. So this is how we'll be able to conditionally style these links based on whether they're active or not. So over in Discord, we can see the style changes when it's active. The text becomes brighter and we have this background. So we just need to know whether the link is active. So we'll want to use our new CID variable, which, in this case is 4, but we can get it in the general case by saying let router equals use router, which we can import from next router. And then we can say this channel link is active if the channel's ID is equal to the router.query.channelID. Now we can come down to our anchor tag, make this an expression, and we'll just drop a conditional right here. If it's active, we'll use these classes, otherwise we'll use those. So over in Discord, we can see when the link is active, this text becomes pure white. We can see it right there. So let's say if we're active, the text should be white. Otherwise, the text should be this gray 300. Okay, so it doesn't seem like our active class is working. And if we pop open the console, we can go ahead and log out the channel and we'll get the router.query. And if we look, we'll see the channel has an ID of 6 that's coming from the data that's generating the sidebar. And the router is giving us our CID and SID here. We'll see that it changes as we navigate. But these are coming in as strings because any dynamic segment from a URL is a string, but our ID here is a number. So when we're checking for active, let's just coerce these both to numbers. And there we go. We see our active state. Now when a link is active, we also have this background. Let's take a look at this. And if we check this out, we'll see it's for F5, which is the gray 550 that we've been using, but the opacity level here is at 32. So if we're active, we want the text to be white and the background to be gray 550 with a 32% opacity. Let's see if that works. Okay, looks great. And we still have the hover treatment in the base case, but we don't have any hover when it's active. So we'll just grab these and move them to the inactive part of our conditional. So now we can see inactive with the hover treatment and then active. And it's all tied to the URL, so we can swipe back and that active state follows it around. We can use these and it all works. Now, one thing that we broke is the active state on these server selectors. So let's go take a look at _app. Right now, these are checking for the path of the URL and seeing whether it matches what we pass in as the href. So first we can update this and just add channel/1 here. And that way when we click on this, we'll at least get to a good URL. But as soon as we click off of channel 1, we'll see that that active state goes away. Now we're still using the nav link for our home button, and we do want that to check against the href. So this is correct for that. But for these, we can just add a new prop here to give ourselves a little more control over when these are active. And for this, we'll say it's active if this server ID parameter in the URL matches the server ID that we're iterating over. And again, if we look over here, we'll see that that just comes from this folder right here, which means we need the router again. So we can just say let router equals use router. And then it's active if the router.query.sid equals the server ID. And again, we'll go ahead and coerce both of these to numbers when we do that check. So let's save that, close our sidebar. And now that we're passing in active, we can come down here, expose this new prop, and we'll say that active equals active. So if the caller's passed it in, we'll just use that, or we'll just fall back to our default check where we compare the path and the href. And we can actually use the new OR assignment operator to kind of do the same thing here. So let's update these to use active. And there we see our active state is working again. So now we're in a good spot with the active state of our channel links. Everything's tied to the URL like it should be, and this is working great. Now, one point I want to make here is that when you start adding dynamic behavior like this, where you're using variables and building up a big class name, is to make sure that your utilities don't ever conflict with each other. So if you were just starting this out, we had text gray 300 on the base string right here, and then you come and add active, and then maybe you say, oh, we want to make this text white, otherwise do something else. And your UI might actually work. When it's active, the text might go white. But you'll notice that you'll be applying two text classes at the same time. And this can lead to unpredictable behavior. Utilities are really best used when they don't conflict or overlap. It leads to much more predictable code because there's only one class that can be responsible for any given CSS property. And if we remove this expression right here, and I were to add text gray 300 and text white like this and save it, you'll actually see that the Tailwind IntelliSense will give us an error, and it says there's a CSS conflict. Text white applies the same CSS properties as text gray 300. So especially when it comes to things like text colors or hover treatments, once you add more dynamic behavior, you really want to pull apart the different states and only apply the classes you need for each state. And this is especially true when the states of a UI component increase to 3 or 4 or 5. This is just a hard-won lesson that I want to make sure and point out. It'll save you lots of time and make your code a lot more maintainable when using utility classes. So now that we have the active and inactive states covered for our channel links, let's go ahead and take care of this third state, the unread state. We can see over in Discord, when you select a channel that has unread messages, the treatment is exactly the same as when we navigate to a channel with no unread messages. So there really are just 3 distinct states here: inactive unread, inactive read, and then active. Now, if we come over and pop open the data that's generating our sidebar here in our clone, we'll see I've added this unread property to some of the channels in this file. And that's because this is really persistent state. It's shared across instances of Discord. If you were to open it on your phone, read it, and then visit it on the website, it would go away. And so this is really persistent state. It's going to be attached to the channel. And that's how we're going to be able to determine whether a channel is unread or not. Now, currently, we're just using this inline tertiary statement to switch between the active and inactive treatment. But whenever I get above 2 states for any UI component, I like to put these in a separate variable just to make it a little bit more clear. So let's define a new variable called state. And if this channel is active, this will just be the string active. Otherwise, if the channel has an unread property, we'll call this state inactive unread. And otherwise, this is going to be inactive read. Now we can define a new variable called classes. And this is going to contain our classes for each state of our link. And we'll use the states as the keys. So the first one will be active. The second will be inactive unread. And the last will be inactive read. So let's come down and grab our active state here and put that in active. And this string of classes corresponds to inactive and read because that's the treatment that we gave these based on when we were working on this in the last video. So we'll come here, grab these, and put them in inactive read. And now let's take a look at the treatment for unread channels. In Discord, if we highlight one of these, we'll see that it's just a pure white treatment. And if it's inactive, an unread channel also has the same hover treatment as the other channels. So we'll just make this text white, and we'll grab this hover treatment for the background. We don't need this class because we'll see that the text doesn't change when we hover it. Now that we have our classes and the current state in this state variable, we should just be able to come down here and replace this with classes for the current state. And now check it out. Whenever we have an unread channel, we get this new treatment, still have the hover treatment, and we still have the active treatment. So that's pretty cool. Okay, if we look over at Discord, we'll see that unread channels also have this extra little indicator here, and we can build it very similar to how we built the server indicator. So let's come over to our anchor tag and make this relative. And we'll just drop a new absolute div right here. Let's give it a width of 2, a height of 2, a background of white, and we'll use left 0 so that it hugs the left of the anchor tag. Okay, so we see our little box. Now, just like before, we have 2 units of space of margin right here. We want this to hug the left side of the column right here. And so we can fix this with some negative margin left of 2, and that should do the trick. Now let's go ahead and make the right side rounded. So rounded, right, and we'll use full since it's a full circle. And this looks a little bit wide. So let's change width 2 down to width 1. And look at that, that's spot on. Now we only want to render these if the channel is actually unread. So we'll wrap this in channel.unread and only render this div if it is. All right, looks pretty good. Now over in Discord, when we click on this, you'll actually see that the unread indicator disappears when the channel is active. And so instead of just being channel unread right here, we really want to use our state and say if it's inactive and unread. So we can just replace this with state is equal to inactive unread. And now we see this indicator only when the channel's not active. So that's pretty cool. Now, one detail we missed was the active state. So when we hover channel and we click, we see the background gets a little bit brighter, and then we let go and it gets even brighter. So that is the active CSS pseudo state, and we used it when we built this little nudge over here on these indicators. So we're going to be able to do the same thing here. Let's just bring up our inspector, find which element activates that pseudo class. And if we click active here, we see that we get that brighter background. And if we take a look at this, we'll see it's at 24% opacity, and it's for F5, which is that BG Gray 550. Now we also see it works on an unread channel and a read channel, but once the channel is active, there is no additional styling for the active pseudo state. So we should just be able to come here and add it to both of these. Active, background, gray, 550 at 24% opacity. And now whenever we click, we should see that little bit of brightness. And yeah, that looks great. All right, one last thing. Let's get the hover state on these buttons here. We can see that the text brightens up a little bit whenever we hover a category group. So we can come and find this div right here, hover it, and then find the H2, and we'll see that the color here is DCD, which is gray 100. So over in our clone, let's come find the button that contains the category, and we'll add hover text gray 100. And there we go. Now over in Discord, you'll see that this hover state and the button itself is clickable all the way over here. I think our button is inline right now, which is what buttons default to. So let's just give it a width of full, and that should take care of that. So now our channel list has all the little interactive bits and the pseudo states covered. It looks really good. It's matching Discord quite nicely, and we've still managed to do this without having to write any CSS ourselves. To build out this category toggling behavior, we'll see that there's actually two elements. First, when we close a category, we'll see that the arrow rotates to the right. And then second, we'll see that all red channels are no longer visible. So to build this out in our clone, we first need to add some state. So let's grab the use state hook from React. We'll start out with an empty array here, and we'll call this closed categories, and then we'll use set closed categories as the setter. Now here is the button element that contains each category label right here. And so when we click on it, we want to run a new function we'll call toggle category, and we'll pass in the category ID. And this is going to come from our loop right here. So let's go ahead and implement this toggle category function right up here. This takes in a category ID, and this will update the closed categories array right here. So we'll call set closed categories, and instead of just passing in the new array, we want to use the function version here since the new array depends on the current value. So we can pass in closed categories and then an arrow function, and now we can write our logic. So if the closed categories includes the category ID that we're passing in right here, then we want to remove it. So we'll return closed categories.filter, and we'll only return categories whose ID is not equal to the category ID we passed in. Otherwise, we want to add this category ID to the array. So we'll create a new array and we'll splat in all of the existing categories, and then we'll append our new category ID to the end. So that should be it for the logic, and now we can actually use this array to update our UI. So we have our arrow icon right here, and Tailwind comes with some transform utilities we can use to rotate the arrow. So we have some low numbers here, but then we can see we have 90, and that points the arrow to the left, but we also have -90 to point it to the right. And if we look at Discord, whenever we close a group, we see that the arrow points to the right. So we should just be able to make this dynamic by turning it into an expression. And then we'll just add a tertiary right here. If closed categories includes this category ID, which again is coming from this loop right here, we'll apply some classes, otherwise we'll apply some others, and we'll just move this rotate 90 right here. So now with any luck, whenever we click a category, we see that we toggle the arrow. And to get that transition in here, we can just drop a transition class, and we can see that rotates nicely. Now it looks like it's a little bit slower over here in Discord, so let's drop this duration down to 200. And yeah, that looks pretty nice. Okay, finally, let's go ahead and filter out the channels if we are viewing a closed category. And we can do that right down here where we're looping over the channels. So right before we loop, let's add a filter here for each channel. And here's where we can write our logic. So if we look over in Discord, we always want to show a channel if it's unread or if the category is open. Otherwise, we'll filter it out. So first we can see if the category is open. We're still inside the loop for this category, so we can say closed categories includes the category ID. If this is true, the category is closed. So if we invert it, we'll say that the category is open. And again, in that case, we always want to return the channel, or we want to return it if the channel is unread. So we should be able to say return category is open or channel is unread. Let's check it out. If we close this category, we see we hide the red channels. So that's pretty neat. And these transform utilities like rotate and scale are really nice, especially if you have animations on icons. You don't want to be swapping icons. You just want to be applying these handy little utilities to a single icon to achieve this result. Now that we have our channel nav working over here, we can actually make this channel header dynamic. If we come over to Discord, we'll see a lot of elements here. And of course, as we navigate, they all change. The title updates, the description updates, and then we have these elements right here. So let's start with getting the title to be dynamic. Right now, we're rendering this static text right here on line 66. But to actually get the title, we're going to, again, poke into our data.js file right here. And we'll see that each channel has a label and a description. So we want to use the channel ID in the URL in order to get that. So I'll just paste in some code right here. And this should look pretty familiar to what we've seen before. We're grabbing the router, and we're going to go ahead and use the router query's server ID to get the server, again, which is just a blob of JSON here for the current server. And then we're going to get all of the categories channels, flatten them, and then find the channel that matches the CID from the router. And that will give us a blob of JSON that looks kind of like this. So this channel variable right here is going to have a label property. So we can come back down here to where we were hard coding this in and change it with channel.label. And now when we click around, we'll see that that title updates. Okay, at this point, we've built a lot of UI that looks a lot like this. So I'm going to paste in all of these buttons and this text, and we're going to focus on the interesting part, which is this description. So let's come back to our clone. Here's our label. And right inside this div, I'll paste in all this code. Let's see how it lines up. Looks like we have a little bit of extra padding here. Let's change this px3 on the wrapper to px2. And now it looks like these things are lining up, with the exception of the search box and the description. So just taking a look at what I pasted in, again, this is pretty standard stuff at this point. We have a flex container. We're using item center, so all these elements line up nicely vertically. We've got the hashtag icon with the fixed width and height. We have some typographic styles. Really nothing fancy going on here. We're wrapping all of these buttons in a div and using margin left auto, which is going to create all of this margin here and push these far over to the right, which again works because we are in a flex container right here. And then we just wrap each one of these icons in a button and give it a little hover treatment similar to what we see on Discord. Okay, so now for the interesting part is we want this description. Now, not every channel has a description. So we can see here, if it doesn't have a description, we don't actually render that little vertical line and the description text. But if we do, we have this little divider here, and then we have the text. So let's come down here below the hashtag and channel title. And we'll conditionally render here based on the channel's description. And let's start with this little vertical line here, right there. We'll just make a div with a width of 1 pixel. This has a height of 24 pixels, which is H6. And if we throw background white on it, then we should see it show up. We'll also give it a little bit of margin. And then the background opacity here is actually 0.06. So now that little divider line matches up nicely. And let's use another div for the channel.description. And because we have these two siblings, let's go ahead and wrap them in a fragment. And here we see our description is rendering. Now this description is text small, font medium, and it's text gray 200. So typographically that looks good. We also want a little bit of margin on this. And now we can talk about the actual layout. So the text here is wrapping in order to try to squeeze into the space that we have, but we don't want that. We want this always to be on a single line. So there's a few ways to control white space in Tailwind. We could use white space no wrap, and that'll force it all to be on one line. Now ultimately we want this kind of truncation behavior that we see over in Discord. If we change the size of this, you'll see that as the window grows, this is really the element that's growing to fill the available space. And it's also shrinking to reserve space for these elements right here, and to preserve the width of the two sidebars. But if we come back to our clone, we'll see that our flexbox layout system has given more room to the description here, and it's pushing off some elements here, and it's also making our sidebar smaller. So we never actually want that, and so we need to learn how to tell our layout which of these columns we actually want to grow and shrink. And if we collapse these, we can see right here is our channel selector, right here is our main channel viewer, and then our server nav is in the app. Well, with Flexbox, the way to do this is to use the flex shrink utilities. If we put this on our third column here, we'll see that nothing happens right away. And this is because a lot of this content is text, and text has sort of a minimum width to it, which Flexbox respects. We need to tell Flexbox here that actually the minimum width of this column should be 0 so that you can shrink down to it if you need to. Okay, so now that we've done that, we'll see that we are keeping the reserved space for the first two columns. This one has shrunk, so we're kind of in a better spot here. But the problem is this line of text is still taking precedence and pushing our icons over. So let's find our channel.description again. And if we were to come here and add overflow hidden and save it, now we'll see that our layout doesn't scroll at all anymore. Our icons are now lining up perfectly with Discord here. You can see just these last two. Again, we don't have the search bar right now, but you can see the space is being reserved for this div right here and this div right here. And this is actually the one that is flexing. So again, controlling layout with flex is really all about marking certain elements as able to be shrunk. And when we have overflow hidden, that's going to tell our layout that you can go ahead and shrink this text node down however far it needs to go. Now, finally, we want to add this truncation behavior, which fortunately comes in CSS, and there's even a Tailwind utility for it. So if we add the truncate class, we'll see that we now have the ellipses. And if we change this to be a little bit more dynamic, we'll see that that works perfectly here. Now, if I hover over this truncate class, we'll see that this is applying overflow hidden and white space no wrap, which is basically exactly how we got to this treatment on our own. And then it's also applying the text overflow ellipsis class here. And this is really one of the only utilities that applies multiple rules, because this ellipsis property really only makes sense alongside these other two. But that means we can actually remove our white space no wrap and remove the overflow hidden. And we'll have exactly the same treatment. So we can play around with this a little bit. We can make it bigger or smaller, and we'll see that this all works. All of the spacing is reserved for every other element. And if we come up here to announcements or some channel that doesn't have a description, it won't render anything. So let's try to compare it here again and see where we ended up. This looks pretty good. Again, our size is off because of that, but everything is looking quite nice right now. And now we've got this dynamic header almost completely built. The last thing to take care of in our channel header here is the search box. And I wanted to make sure to cover at least a little bit about form controls, because there's really only one trick you need to know. If we pop open package.json here, we'll see that I've already installed the Tailwind CSS Forms plugin. Once you install that, you come to your Tailwind config, come down here and add it to your plugins array. And this plugin effectively just applies some sensible defaults to all input fields in your app, making them just as easy to style with Tailwind utilities as other elements in your page. So let's come and see how it looks. We'll see that the search box goes right after the people icon right here. So I'm just going to come down, find people, and let's drop in a new div right here with an input field. We'll see it has kind of sensible defaults for the input field, and it's really easy to tweak with just normal Tailwind utilities. So let's drop a class name on this. First thing we can see, this is dark. This has a background of gray 900. And it also has no border. So we can just say border none. The height of this is also an even 24 pixels. So we can make this a fixed height using H6 for 24 pixels. And the width is actually constrained to 144 pixels. So if we come down here, we can go up and see 144 is included by default at W36. Now let's zoom in a little bit here so we can really see the details. We'll also notice that there's a bit of rounding here, so we can come and add rounded. And we need a little bit more spacing around this. So let's add this to the wrapper div. We'll throw mx2 right here. Okay, so that's looking like it's lining up quite nicely. Let's go ahead and add this placeholder text of search. And the way we style this placeholder text is just with the normal typography utilities. So this is going to be text SM and font medium. And it looks like it's a little bit brighter. So instead of text gray, which is what would affect the actual text in the input, we can use placeholder, and we'll see all the colors are available to us here as well. So let's try placeholder gray 300. Okay, that's a little too bright, so let's go to 400. And it looks like there's a little bit less padding between the placeholder and the outside of the input. That's controlled with padding, so let's try padding X1. Or maybe 2. Okay, looks like 1.5. Look at that, spot on. Finally, we can add this hourglass icon using some absolute positioning. So let's add relative here. We'll drop a new div with absolute right here. And we can throw in our icons.spyglass right here. The spyglass is 16 by 16, so it's going to be width 4, height 4. There it is. And let's go ahead and position our div. Whenever I do things like this, I like the div to kind of cover this area, and then the div can use flex and item center to center any of its children. So we'll put the containing div all the way to the right with right 0. And then we want the top to be 0 and the bottom to be 0. And there's a shortcut for top and bottom 0. It's just inset y 0. So now if we inspect this div, we'll see, it's taking up this whole space. We can just make it a flex parent with item center, and that should take care of centering this icon. Now the icon's over a little bit, so when we come down here, add margin to the right, 1.5. And let's make it a little bit darker with text gray 400. Okay, check that out. That's pretty pixel perfect. We're only using the default scales here. And if we zoom out, we'll see that our layout's looking really nice as we move around channels here. And, our layout techniques from earlier lessons are taking effect. We're reserving the space right here for all these elements. And even if we were to change this, again, we'll see that the description there gets truncated, but this is always preserved just like that. Let's check out a few more channels. Okay, it looks like we might have missed no wrapping on the channel.label. So let's drop a white space no wrap right here. That should take care of it. And so yeah, when it comes to these forms, again, basically the only trick is to remember to install this forms plugin and register it. And then, there's quite a lot of work that goes into resetting these inputs so they behave predictably when we do things like change their padding, their height, their colors across all browsers. All the hard work is done for us in that plugin, and that just lets us style these exactly like we've been styling the rest of our UI. Okay, the time has come to replace our dummy messages with the message component that we wrote at the very beginning of this course. So I'm going to come over here to our clone where we're iterating over these 40 messages right here. And I'm just going to replace it with just a slightly modified version of what we started out with. Just a few tweaks with the colors, but mostly exactly what we had at the beginning. So there we see it being rendered. We see we have some extra padding here on this wrapping div, and we also had space Y, which was putting space in between each div here. But let's just remove that so we can fill up the entire width just like we do on Discord. Now, for the most part, what we started out with looks really good. I just want to highlight one thing. You'll see the line height is pretty tight here on Discord, and by default, Tailwind applies different line heights to different font sizes. And again, we can just see it's a little bit tighter over here on Discord. So the way we can change this is with the leading utilities. And again, for typography best practice reasons, there's a pretty tight relationship between what the line height should be based on the text size, and the defaults do follow best practices, but in our case, we want to tighten them up a little bit. Discord actually uses a line height here of 22 pixels. We'll see that's in between leading 5 and leading 6. So again, we'll just use the just-in-time compiler and throw leading 22 pixels on this div. And we can see that tightens it up a little bit. Let's also do it to these second two messages right here and right here. Leading of 22 pixels. And now this is looking a lot more like what we see over here on Discord. I think we have a little bit more padding on Discord as well in the right direction. So let's change these PX4s to add some padding left of 4 and some padding right, say, of 6. Or maybe even 16. Okay, so that helps us see that we're matching up almost exactly with the typography here for the messages. So now let's actually make these dynamic. if we look in our data file, we'll see that each channel has a messages property with a kind of randomly generated message. And the data looks like this. It has an ID, user avatar ID, date, and text. So all we need to do is come up here to where we're creating this random array of 40 elements, and instead we should be able to access the current channel's messages, call.map to loop over them, and for each message we can now return this div. We'll key the div by message ID, and now we see our messages rendering again. So in this treatment we have kind of this div that includes the author and the date, and then these two divs right here and right here, they contain text if the author of this message is the same as the previous one. So for now, let's just comment these out and start replacing this with the dynamic data from our data.js file. So the image source here will be message.avatar URL. The username will be message.user. The date will be message.date. And the text here will be message.text. Okay, this is looking pretty great. But we see we don't have the treatment where the author is the same, then we drop the name and the other information from subsequent messages. So to take care of that, let's first create a new component, just so this doesn't get too messy here. I'm going to copy all of this HTML, and we'll come down and make a message with user component that returns that. Now we want to pass in the message here as a prop. And then right here, we can render the message with user component, passing in the message. Now let's come down here, create a second component just called message, which will also take in a message as a prop. And this will return just the HTML we need right here, which should only render the message text. So now we have kind of both treatments right here. And we can do a little bit of logic using the message as well as the index from our loop. So if we're the very first message, we definitely want to show the user, but also if this message has a different user than the previous one, we want to render the message with the user as well. So we should be able to say if the index is 0, that means we're the first message, or the current message.user is not equal to the previous one. And we can get that by channel.messages and then pulling the index out just from one before the current index, so I-1. And then grab the user off of that. So in either of these cases, we want to render the message with the user. Otherwise, we want to render just the message. Whoops, that should say channel.messages. And check this out. Now we've got the first user always rendering, but also if any of the messages follow the same user, we don't have the first treatment, we have the second one. And this is looking really cool. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Get out of the responsive mode here. And just take a little look. So this is Discord, and then here's our clone. Typography really matches just perfectly here. We've got the fonts, we've got the line height, and we have different messages here for each channel, so it's kind of fun to play around. We can hit the forward and back button here. I can zoom out a little bit just to see all of our layouts. All of our scroll containers are working. We can scroll this pane independently. If we zoom in, we can scroll this pane independently. Move this all around. We still have our collapsing categories here. And so, yeah, we've really filled out a good amount of the Discord interface here just using Tailwind. And this is a pretty awesome result. Okay, our clone is looking great. We've been working on this Tailwind CSS server here, and all this works. The navigation works. We can go forward and back. We can reload the app, and all of the active states are correct, but we kind of broke some of our nav in the process. So if we click next here, we'll see we have an error. So we just need to update a little bit of this to make this all dynamic again. Now I went ahead and updated the format just a tad of this data file. Before we were using keys for IDs for each server, I just made this a normal array of objects and updated the code right here to use that new format. So let's go back to Tailwind and fix these server links. So these are over in our root app file. And when we started, we were just iterating over this hard-coded data. So let's delete this, import our data file from data. And down here, again, data is just a plain array now, so we can iterate over data for each server. Okay, so our server nav is working again. We can still click around here, but if I click on next, we'll see we get an error. And that's because right now we're hard coding this channel ID of 1, but each channel has a unique ID across all the servers. So 1 belongs to Tailwind, but the first channel in next is 17. So instead, we're just going to link to the first channel in each server. So server.categories, we'll grab the first category, .channels, grab the first channel, and then put the ID right there. So now if we go back, Tailwind still works. And let's try clicking on next. And now we navigate to an actual channel in next. But we see the channel nav here hasn't updated. So let's take a look at that. We were hard coding in just the Tailwind server right here. But instead of doing that, we already find the current server based on the router query. So let's just grab the server instead. Server.categories. And now they update. Now finally, if I click on one of those links, we again get an invalid URL. So let's come down and look at our channel link, and we'll see we had hard-coded servers 1 right here. So to get the current server, we already have the router. Let's just come grab this code right here, paste it in our channel link, and then replace this with the current server's ID. We'll go back to a valid URL. And now check this out. All of our links are working again. The active state's good. We've got our descriptions right here. If we zoom out, we'll be able to see them. Our toggles are working. We can go to any of our servers. And yeah, this is actually starting to feel like a real app now. The last main piece of our clone I want to cover is responsive design. So we've been working off of the desktop view, and when we shrink this, we do have some nice layout behavior here, but obviously this won't work when we're on an iPhone. And we can see already that we have some issues here. So right here I have a screenshot of the Discord app on the phone, and we can see mainly we're just hiding the server nav from the left, as well as the channel nav. These actually come out in a collapsible menu right here. And we also simplify the header a little bit. So let's work on adding this to our clone. First, we want to hide this server nav, and this lives in our root app page. If we scroll down, we'll see this div contains everything in there. So basically, we want to hide all this on mobile. Now, Tailwind has a hidden utility, which we can see sets display none. And so if we add that, that will hide. But of course, we don't want to hide it on desktop. We want it to start out hidden and then show it once we get to a certain breakpoint. And the way we do this in Tailwind is with responsive prefixes. So there's one called MD, which stands for medium. And we can see right there that it applies to a minimum width of 768. So at 768, if we set the display back to block, which is the default for a div, now we can see this showing up at 768 pixels, but if we were to shrink this a little bit, it will hide. So that's basically the idea behind working with responsive design in Tailwind. You use all exactly the same utilities, you just prefix ones you want to apply at certain breakpoints. Tailwind has a few different breakpoints by default. We have small at 640, medium at 768, large at 1024, extra large at 1280, and then 2XL at 1536. And of course, all these can be customized. But just for now, we're going to stick with medium for the 768 breakpoint. And that's basically the idea. So let's also do the same thing to our channel list here. This is over in our CID page. I believe it's this div right here. Here's our channel list, and here's our main channel area. So we want this to be defaulted to hidden. We'll see right there, we have a nice error message telling us hidden applies the same CSS property as flex. And so since we're making this flex, we only want this to show up again on the medium breakpoint. So now that's hidden below 768. And once we get to 768, it should appear alongside our server nav. And the way we've constructed this layout, we really don't have to change anything. Flexbox is taking care of making sure these sizes all work for us as we add and remove elements. Now, another small point is that these are mobile first breakpoints, which means they are minimum width, which is generally a best practice in responsive design. So even though we've been building this as a desktop, because I wanted to focus on all the details that we've been focusing on, usually when I build a responsive site, I would start by implementing the mobile version first. And then as you get to bigger breakpoints, layering on these utilities prefixed with the responsive breakpoints. So let's shrink this down a little bit. Check out our screenshot again. And here we can see the header is really simplified to basically just the channel title. We have the hashtag with message icon and then the Teams icon over here. So if we open up our main area div here and find the header, this is kind of what we've been working with. Here's the channel description and here's the label. So we can do the same thing for the description. Let's start with it hidden on mobile and then put it back to block for tablets. So now that hides. And again, it shows up once we get bigger. But now let's take a look at these elements. These are all inside this div right here. And presumably if this was a production app, there'd be a lot more functionality with all of these buttons and running this search that were suitable to desktop. So we could come here and basically apply the same technique, and start hiding the things that we don't need. Maybe this bell goes away, so it's hidden, medium, inline, something like that. But as you can see, sometimes it gets a little confusing if the differences between a particular part of your template in mobile and desktop are large. If there's a lot of differences, sprinkling a lot of these responsive classes everywhere can make it a little bit hard to follow what's going on. So while that technique worked great for our layout, in this case, I would actually take a slightly different approach. I would just drop a comment right here that says desktop buttons. And then let's just create a new one called mobile buttons. Let's grab this, paste it right here. And if we take a look at the screenshot, we'll see we really only need the hashtag with speech bubble icon for threads. And then we need the people. So we can delete all the rest of this like that. Save that. And now if we come back, we're doubling up, but we want to make this one visible on mobile, which it is by default, and then hide it at 768. So we'll say medium hidden, and that will apply the display none class at 768 pixels. And then we want to come down to our desktop and do the opposite. So we'll say hidden, and then we'll make this medium flex. So now we have a much simpler header here to work with these buttons. We don't need to go looking for where our responsive utilities are. It's just easy to see when we're working on mobile, which has, a pretty drastically different treatment than desktop. This is what we need to look at. Otherwise, once we get up to 768, we'll just switch back over to this one, and this will hide just fine. So that's kind of my two ways of thinking about working with responsive utilities in Tailwind. They're super easy to just sprinkle in if you have small changes to make between breakpoints, but when you have larger ones, you can just separate them out. There's no, always right or wrong answer here. You'll just get better with experience and knowing when to use which strategy. But with that, we have a pretty nice clone here. Of course, building all the mobile navigation is pretty involved and beyond the scope of this course, but you can see that our flexbox layout, our fixed header is working really nice. The scroll is working nice. And when we go up to laptop size, we see all of our original elements and everything is looking really great.